Welcome to Chapter 13 lecture. It's really friggin' early. It is, shall I tell you, it is 6:21 a.m. So you may or may not see the sun start to rise while I do this. My days start pretty early, and I really wanted all of these chapter lectures up before your quarter began, and the quarter begins today, Tuesday, but it would seem adjusting PowerPoints for a brand new textbook takes a lot longer than anticipated. So I just finished making this one my own, and we're going to cover it. It's a little bit different than how I've done it before because, like I said, brand new textbook. So if I'm a little it's because I am getting used to the new one, but I really wanted to make it as matched to the text that you currently have as possible. So, without further ado, here comes Chapter 13, How Populations Evolve. So, starting off with an introduction, this should be your first look at the new book's PowerPoints. Every one of these, they start off with an intro, kind of like last quarter for those who had me, where I had that little bit of information beforehand, so then you can basically explain why this chapter is important. That's what this is. So this one's talking about the World Health Organization trying to get rid of malaria. And as I'm sure you remember, we talked about malaria last quarter too, when we talked about sickle cell, which we talk about later in this one as well. Anyway, in order to get rid of malaria, they were like, holy crap, we need to get rid of all these mosquitoes because, again, the mosquitoes are spreading it through the life cycle of the plasmodium. Anyway, so what they did is they tried really hard to get rid of all the mosquitoes, and they sprayed DDT all over everything. Well, this basically caused a whole lot of issues, and one of them was that it made a lot of the mosquitoes resistant to DDT. Mainly because if you're killing off all of the weakest ones, the ones that aren't affected by it keep reproducing, hence a lot of mosquito populations becoming resistant. We'll go into this a little bit more in just a moment. So as of today, malaria causes more than 1 million deaths and 250 million cases of illnesses each year. So pretty bad. Oh, here we go. Anyone heard of this drug lately? The drug chloroquine? It's been all in the news. No, it does not cure coronavirus, just so you know. I know that's been touted quite a bit, but it does not cure coronavirus. They thought this might be the miracle cure for malaria. However, considering they constantly used it in areas, what ended up happening was the parasite that causes malaria, the one whose life cycle is involved. I talked about it in Bio 123. This parasite's now getting resistant to it, and so now they had a drug that did work, but it's been used so much and overused that now the parasite's resistant, and so now it doesn't work. Pretty much why you're not supposed to say, hey, this is the miracle cure, and then tell everybody to use it, because all you're doing is making something a little stronger. And that's what evolution is. So just to be clear, evolution is not just humans came from monkeys, which, by the way, nobody ever said, or at least no one in the science community ever said. Darwin did not say it, but we'll get to Darwin in a little bit. So understanding evolution informs all of biology, from exploring life's molecules to analyzing ecosystems. So basically what you have to understand is that evolution is huge. It is a change over generations. It's a continuous thing. It's basically the entire group adapting to what's going to help it survive. That's pretty much it. So, big ideas. Every one of these chapters, we're going to have that little intro and then something that says big ideas. The big ideas, these are the main things we are going to cover throughout that chapter. So, chapter 13, big ideas, is Darwin's theory of evolution, Please dump any of your preconceived notions about what Darwin actually said so you can concentrate on the actual scientific aspect. Then we're going to talk about the evolution of populations, and then blending these mechanisms of microevolution. All right, here we go. Darwin's theory of evolution. And it just occurred to me as I did this, I didn't add any of my old pictures from my previous things, but I'm going to tell you some of them, just so you know. So, Darwin, Charles Darwin. I'm pretty sure most people have heard this name, and a lot of people have misunderstood it. So, best known for the book On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. Most people just call it The Origin of the Species. What baffles me are the number of people who will say this is what Darwin said when they haven't even read the book. I actually own this book, and I have read it, mainly because I hate to be a hypocrite, and I didn't want to say what a book said if I didn't actually read it. But we're going to go into what it actually means. So, Darwin had an idea, and it did not match what a lot of other people said. And he figured that things change over time. That's pretty much it. When Darwin was alive, most people just said, this is the way it is, this is the way it's always been, that kind of thing. And he did this traveling, and I'll get to that in a second, and went, I'm noticing that these are very similar, but they're different. So could they have started this way and then become this? That kind of thing. So his theory was descent with modification. That means that for each generation, the descendants, that there was a slight change, and that's what caused this group over here to be so different than this group over here. So that's why it says all of life is connected by common ancestry. It means there was a common ancestor here that branched off. That does not mean ancestor like regular general terms where you think your ancestor, you think grandpa. This means something way back here that branched. I guess the best way to look at that would be if you look at, I don't know, we'll say an eighth cousin. I want it massively removed. You might look and sound and behave completely different with a family member that's that spread apart. But if you go far enough back up the thing, you're going to notice something. I guess instead of eighth cousin, because I really don't understand that second, third, fourth, fifth cousin thing, maybe think of a family tree and then have you over here and then go back to your great 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 grandfather. Think of how many differences would happen along that, because if that great grandfather, great to the power of, I think I said 11 or maybe 15, I don't know, I was doing this but then I lost track. So imagine great to the power of 15 grandfather. If he had, say, 10 kids, and each of those kids had between 5 and 10 kids, and then each of those kids had, if you do this all the way down, you are going to be so far removed, but you would still have that little genetic core. That's pretty much what he's talking about for the common ancestor. Okay, descendants have accumulated adaptations to changing environments over vast spans of times. All this means is that each of the descendants, each of the offspring, each of the kids, however you want to word it, basically adjusted. Something adjusted to where they lived, the environment, in order to make it where they would survive. And it was not instantaneous. It's not like the kid is born and then goes, oh, this area is really hot, and then all the hair fell out. It's more like that kid might have been super hairy, and then they're in a very hot area, and so their kids had a little bit less hair, and then those kids had a little bit less hair, and then those kids had a little bit less hair over a long period of time until suddenly they don't have hair. And why did I use that as an example? I don't know. It's just the one that popped into my head. So, scientists regard Darwin's concept of evolution by means of natural selection as a theory. Now remember, in Bio 123, we talked about the difference between a hypothesis and a theory. Theory means we have looked and looked and looked and looked and looked, and a whole bunch of these hypotheses bring you back to the same point. So that same point is the theory. Yeah, it is not like your common term when people go, in theory, is that a good idea? Most of the time when people, and when I say people, I mean non-science people, most of the time, the common lay person, I think that's the right term, says, in theory, they're meaning more like hypothetically, or, something along those lines. So, here we go. Checkpoint question. There's going to be checkpoint questions throughout here. Sometimes I'm going to discuss the answer with you. Sometimes I'm just going to say it and tell you that you should think about it and look it up. And sometimes I'm actually going to supply the answer in the PowerPoint. I kind of vary it. And again, this is me just getting used to the new format, so my apologies. But I'm trying to train myself so I can do this through the whole quarter. Anyway, checkpoint question. What was Darwin's phrase for evolution, and what does it mean? Anybody know? She asks to an empty room because no one's in this room with her. Why in the world did I just ask if anybody knows? It's not like you can go, I do. But anyway, survival of the fittest is the main thing most people know. And it has a completely different connotation than most people say. Survival of the fittest, and I think we talk about it later on in here too. Survival of the fittest means the one most fit for that environment. That means that if, every quarter I end up talking about the sneaky frog. I'm going to get there. But the survival of the fittest means the one that is best able to survive in that location. It does not mean as in like, I am the most physically fit person. So here again, there is the scientific phrasing and then there's the layperson phrasing. And this is honestly a pet peeve of mine, and it will be a question on a test. I promise you this, about explaining to me the difference and what it really, really means. Survival of the fittest does not mean the biggest and the strongest, because sometimes the biggest and the strongest is not the best suited for the environment, and they are not going to be the ones that survive. I think I have a lot of church people normally in my classes. One of the things in the Bible is the meek shall inherit the earth. Anybody remember that one? The meek shall inherit the earth. If you want to use that phrase to prove evolution, the meek would be the fittest for that location. So survival of the fittest would actually be the meek are the ones who survived, because all of the big, loud, powerful, violent, whatever people killed each other. So the ones that were like, you're going, you go right ahead. These people survived. Best fit for the environment. Now, sneaky frog. And yes, I know I go off on tangents, but you've mostly had me before, so you already know this. The sneaky frog, the reason I find them fascinating, and I love talking about them when I talk evolution, is you've got this little sneaky male, okay? Frog, big old bullfrog doing his burp, 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 trying to call his mates. So when you hear that big burp, burp, that is the male frog shouting out for the girls. So he's like, hello, I'm over here. Come mate with me. And then you've got the female frogs going, I hear him. And they're like, dum, 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 and they go trying to find him. Then you have this little big sneaky male. He is nowhere near as big as that big, loud frog. The females are attracted to that loud frog because they're like, shoot, he's that loud. He must be able to survive very well. Those are the best genes for my offspring. And so they're hopping towards that male frog. Got our little sneaky male over here. He's just kind of like tucked in back here in between the path of the females and that loud frog. When the female arrives, sneaky male hops out and then he mates with her. She doesn't realize that he's the sneaky male. She just knows she was coming to the call. Sneaky male hops out, mates with the female. She hops off. Meanwhile, loud guy over here is still waiting for a female to show up. Loud guy continues to survive because there's not enough sneaky males pretty much to take all the women. Well, they're not women, but all the females. So enough females get through that this loud guy still does get to reproduce. But there are more of the sneaky males because he has learned how to make it work for him. So he is actually more fit for his environment. His genes will go on and go on and go on because he's getting most of the girls. There you go. Alrighty, so here we've got a picture of Darwin, and this is showing where he sailed, and it's showing a picture of his ship, which was the Beagle. Oh yeah, it says right there, HMS Beagle. I just always remember Beagle. Now, what you are supposed to learn is the fact that he was on the ship and it went around and they stopped at these different ports and all these different areas. He went to shore and he was cataloging various species, and he noticed in certain areas, the Galapagos was one of the main areas, that he's most known for his work on finches. He noticed that the finches, the birds, they had these different shaped beaks, and the shape of the beak dictated what their diet was. But they looked so similar, and so he figured out with this that each of these finches basically adapted, they evolved specialized beaks for that very specific kind of food, whether it was nuts and berries or insects or something burrowed. Each beak had to be specialized. This way they didn't have to compete all with each other because it's a limited amount of food, especially on an island. So limited amount of food, so these birds, these finches, evolved different levels of feeding, and their beaks showed the difference. Now, the part I like to share, because my genetics teacher taught me this one, and it cracked me up, was Darwin, Charles Darwin. He really hated the sight of blood, could not stand it. He also hated being on a ship. He got seasick very easily. Well, his father wanted him to become a surgeon. Imagine becoming a surgeon back in that day. It's not like now. They didn't quite understand nearly as much, and it was a very traumatic kind of thing. It's not like they could easily, very carefully and calmly put people sleeping and keep all of the nerves deadened while it was a lot of screaming and a lot of horrible. It was terrifying. But anyway, his parents wanted him to be a surgeon, and he didn't want to, puked at the sight of blood pretty much. And he then he refused to become a doctor. And when he refused to become a doctor, his father forced him to join this expedition, which caused him to have to be on a ship. And the reason he went on shore continuously is simply because he got so seasick. So we ended up getting this incredible lesson, learning all about evolution from Darwin, and he's not the only one. I'll get to that in a little bit. We got this incredible stuff from Darwin solely because he didn't want to be a surgeon, and his father was punishing him by making him hop on a boat. I think that's kind of interesting. Look at that. Quick little bit of an edit. So you may have noticed things look a little different behind me. The sun is starting to come up. In the midst of recording, my son woke up, showed up, waved. He normally works nights, but right now he's switching to days, and so this early morning is the only chance I'm going to really have to get to see him today. And I was trying to record this before he got up, but oops, he got up early. So I stopped so I could go make breakfast, have breakfast with my son and everything, and now I'm back. And the sun's coming up, so now you don't see it's just dark behind me. Anyway, here we go. We are now to the study of fossils. Presumably everybody has heard of fossils. These are imprints or remains of organisms that lived in the past. Most people, when you think of a fossil, you think of like dinosaur bones and stuff like that, but there's more than just bones. There's a whole bunch of different things. And it's through studying these fossils that we can see how things have changed over the course of generations, which again is what evolution is. So, there you go. Now, fossils of transitional form support Darwin's theory of evolution. So, here you go. Bunch of fossils are going to show that different extinct species way back when are extremely similar to species living today. Then we have things that are referred to as living fossils. I don't know if you've heard of those, but alligators are one of those. Sharks are one of those. It's where you look way far back in the fossil record and you see very small changes because they were so perfectly adapted to where they were, they didn't really need to change. Other things needed to change in order to stay there, but those suckers, nope, they're good. Yeah, okay. So, beginning in the late 1970s, paleontologists, those are the people who study fossils, they unearthed transitional fossils and thought that whales arose from a wolf-like carnivore. Clearly, a lot of people would be like, what? But then we had molecular biologists who came in and took a look at the molecular makeup, the DNA and stuff like that, and they found out that there was a close relationship between whales and hippos. Isn't that pretty cool? It looks like both whales and hippos are descendants from a cloven-hoofed ancestor. Now, before you go, what in the world? Couple of things. One, and we get into this more at a later date. You have to remember a whale is a mammal, and most of the sea creatures in the ocean are fish. And there's a couple of very important differences. The easiest way to tell, other than the obvious of breathing air, is tails. If you look at the tails, a fish, the tail goes like this. A mammal, the tail goes like this. So if you think of a whale, their tail goes like this. Dolphin, like this. Manatee, like this. Even if you want to go into the fake world, a mermaid goes like this. But if you think of a shark, it's like this. If you think of a tuna, it's this. Halibut, this. Sunfish, this. So that is where, and we're going to come to homologous and analogous and stuff like that in just a moment, but that's where some things are designed differently for the same purpose. And whether or not it looks like it formed the same way or didn't has to do with the evolution aspect. So by the whale's tail doing this and us knowing it is a mammal, it's more likely that it will be related to other mammals. Yeah, in a couple of chapters, I think we do the evolution of animals, and then we'll cover that a little bit more. I have to remember to come back to Lamarck and some other Anaximander, some other evolution people. Anyway, here we go. 2 fossils discovered in 2001 provided the actual answer about what the whale is related to. So, I can't say these names, but both of these have the distinctive ankle bone of a cloven-hoofed mammal. I have a picture here that's showing you, and you can see it's color-coded to show you the pelvis, the femur, the tibia, and the foot. So this is actually what they're looking at to see how it all just slowly adjusted, because I know you have to be thinking ankle bone in a whale because they don't have feet, but they do have these little bones, little parts that are still there left over. So kind of interesting. Because of this, scientists are becoming more confident about the evolutionary origin of the whales. Now, A lot of people are like, who cares? Other people, they just like to know things. So entirely up to you. I haven't looked all the way through chapter 14 yet because that's the next PowerPoint I'm going to be doing. But I normally talk about the, why is it blanking from me? It's a transitional fossil. It's showing the Archaeopteryx. There you go. It's showing you when dinosaurs transition to birds. That's my favorite transitional fossil. But it's not in this PowerPoint, so hopefully we'll come to it. Otherwise, I'll just talk all about it and throw it in somewhere. But this is what I think is interesting. Homologies. If you remember from Bio 123, homo means same. So homologies, homology, however you want to do this thing, it basically means that it's similar. So evolution is a process of descent with modification. We said that earlier, and that just means that each generation has a slight change to it until all of a sudden it's like way different. So evolution is a remodeling process. It's kind of adjusting everything. Related species can have characteristics that have an underlying similarity yet function differently. So similar but different, and similarity. Why are these words so hard today? Resulting from common ancestry is known as homology. So here is one of my favorite pictures, and I was so happy to see it still in this textbook because I love this one. This is showing you homologies in certain evolutionary relationships. So again, this is color-coded. It's showing you the humerus, which is this bone, radius and ulna, so it's the radius and the ulna right here, carpals, which is what you have here, metacarpals, and phalanges. So this is for the human hand. Now, if you look at the cat's arm, paw, whatever you want to call it, very similar. Like, you can look at that and see every bit of it. And this is where you see for the paw, the claws are actually the last digit of the finger. So that's like the equivalent of this for us. It's just they can pull theirs back in, which is really friggin' cool. Now, the whale. The whale is the phenomenal one. Because if you look, the phalanges are just a lot longer, but that is actually what is in the whale's flipper. So when you look at the front flippers, the pectoral fins of a whale, these are the bones that are in the whale's pectoral fin, the flippers. Same makeup, which shows that it modified from the other. And then the bat. Oh my gosh, the bat is my favorite because it makes you realize that huge wing is actually just a hand. So you've got the arm, and then this is just the hand, like with fingers that you just go woof, and then they just spread out, and it's all the webbing in between that makes it the wing that it is. And I just think that's pretty friggin' cool. All right, so this again is showing you a little bit more about how some stuff is similar, but some stuff is different. One of your very first labs is an embryo lab. This is showing you why we're doing the embryo lab. Because as embryos, you can see more than you can once they're fully developed. You can see some of these similarities. So here we have a chick embryo and we have a human embryo. Both of them are marked. They say which ones they are. Both of them really, really young. And when I say really young, I'm talking in development because an embryo is not yet a baby. An embryo is still developing. You can see both of them have these little pouches up here. You can also see them in fish, actually. And then the post-anal tail. Most humans are not born with a tail, but you do have that tail bone. So, pretty sure everybody has heard of their tailbone. It's actually there. And what's really interesting here is these are known as vestigial structures. There are some stuff that still show up that we do not use anymore, which is why it's called a vestigial structure. So that would be our post-anal tail, because we as humans typically do not have tails. And I know I keep saying typically, but it's because on occasion somebody is born with a little bit of a tail and then they have to, take care of it. But for the most part, humans are not normally born with a tail. So that would be a vestigial structure. It's something left over from way back when. Another one is a vestigial organ. So instead of a structure, it's an organ. And the appendix is a perfect example, because the appendix for a human is not needed anymore, but we still have it because way throughout we have always had it. Normally in class somebody asks, then why don't we just always have it removed? Because the only time you really notice your appendix as a human is when it gets infected, it starts to swell, and then it's dangerous, because if the appendix bursts, it can kill you. I actually have a friend who a few years ago, that's what happened to her husband, and he did pass. It was pretty disturbing because I had always read that could happen, and this was the first case where I actually saw it happen. You know what I mean? But mammals needed the appendix to help break things down and help with a whole processing thing. So if you actually look at the insides of a rabbit still has the whole appendix thing. Humans, it's like shrinking up and it's just there. But the only reason we don't just automatically have it removed is that's a pretty big surgery, and you don't want to just cut somebody open and start removing things when you don't have to. That's why it's only taken out when it gets infected, just so you know. But vestigial structure, like our tail, and vestigial organ would be like our appendix. Now, biologists represent patterns of descent with an evolutionary tree. The tree oftentimes is turned sideways. We're about to have a picture of it. There's also the phylogeny tree. They have different types of trees, and how you learn to read these trees helps you better understand how closely related certain species are to each other. So these similarities can be either an anatomical structure or a molecular structure, because there's different ways to look at things. They used to just do more of a like visual, but then the deeper they got into it, when they started testing molecular structures, DNA, that opened up so many things, and we realized how many things we were wrong on. So here is one of the trees. This is an evolutionary tree, and it wants you to look at crocodiles. So looking at this, they want to know, are crocodiles more closely related to lizards or birds? Well, I'm going to use the laser pointer in order to show you this. So each of these means there's a common ancestor. So here we have a common ancestor. Over here, the lungfishes stayed. And then down here, they branched. This is where we got tetrapod limbs. Tetra for 4, pod for feet. So tetrapod means 4 feet. So this is where the 4 feet start to show up. And then we have our amphibians. And at this common ancestors, where the amphibians branched off, and then we got down here where it says amnion. Amnion, that's where we were able to start having things like the amniotic egg. What this is, and we'll get more into this when we talk evolution of animals, but I figure may as well cover it because it's right there. This is the stuff that the young actually develop in. So for mammals, we have the amniotic fluid, but for the eggs, it's an amniotic egg. So it has all the stuff in there for the embryo to develop. Anyway, so that's where the amnion begins. And then up here, we have our mammals. That would be us. We're in here. And down here is where we break up to lizards and snakes and crocodilians and stuff. So lizards and snakes are up here. They tend to have different makeup. And then down here we have crocodiles. And then here we branch off and we have feathers. Then we have our ostriches, which, huge suckers, and they run, they don't really fly. and then we have hawks and other birds. So according to this, clearly hawks and ostriches are more closely related than an ostrich and a crocodile because they have the same common ancestor. But to answer the checkpoint question, the way you use this tree is here's the common ancestor. So the birds have a common ancestor with the crocodiles. That means crocodiles are more closely related to birds than they are to lizards. Isn't that bizarre? Because you would just assume lizards, but nope. All right. Now, Darwin's greatest contribution to biology was his explanation of how life evolves. Not the fact that it does evolve, but how. He's the one who, again, said descent with modification. And he pointed out that we have little bits of changes and that we could actually do this with artificial selection. So natural selection is what nature does. Artificial is what we do. Example of this is, I believe, cabbage, Napa cabbage, and Brussels sprouts are all in the mustard family. And so it's how you tweak it that you get the variations. And I know that's a weird one. What might be a better example for most people are, think of the different breeds of dogs. If you want to make sure you have a proper Dalmatian, you are going to keep breeding the Dalmatians to make sure you have the white fur and the black spots. If you want, now we have all these designer breeds, so like a Labradoodle, they took Labrador and Poodle and they kept breeding these guys until it became their own breed. That is artificial selection. That is choosing what you want to show and doing all the crosses. They do this often with flowers as well. This is how they get those specialized flowers or the perfect orchids. It's used in agriculture a lot. It's used in cattle, like beef cattle. If you know that this bull produces huge calves, and so if you keep breeding this bull and then breeding the offspring from that bull, and you keep doing this, breeding it so you can get bigger and bulkier cattle for more meat, that is artificial selection. So Darwin reasoned if artificial selection can bring about so much change in a short period of time, then natural selection could do it over a long period of time. Because artificial, we're forcing it to happen. Natural selection just kind of takes place. Now, yeah, we'll look at this one and then I'll tell you about Lamarck. So, here we go. This is showing you that we have our observations. You notice there's heritable variations in individuals. We covered this in the genetic stuff in 1, 2, 3. Overproduction of offspring. This means there's a whole bunch of babies. They're not all going to survive. So the ones who are best suited to the environment are going to actually reproduce more, so leave more offspring. And over time, the ones that have the traits that are more likely to survive are going to be the ones that are more in the population. One of the more famous examples of this had to do with moths. And it was the color of the moths because the moths are eaten by the birds. And what they found is when an area got polluted, so the air had a slightly different tint, were these moths that had a more similar tint, more of a grayish, they tended to survive and reproduce more. So instead of having all the white moths, you had these grayer moths survive. And it was just simply because the white moths stood out more because the gray ones blended with the polluted air. So the birds were picking off all the white moths. That's one of the more common ones here. So this is basically what Darwin is saying overall. Now, yes, I am going to get to Lamarck and Anaximander in just a moment. just want to make sure I cover enough of this first, because these are ones that are just, ones I like to make sure you know about. And in my previous PowerPoint, before this textbook, I used to always talk about Lamarck, and I had this little picture and I forgot to put it in, so I want to tell you about it. Now, Darwin proposed natural selection as the mechanism of evolution. So again, saying that nature is dictating what is going to survive. So, important to emphasize 3 key points about natural selection. 1, although natural selection occurs through interactions between individual organisms and the environment, individuals do not evolve. That is the key phrase. Individual does not evolve. That means, like me sitting here, I don't suddenly become perfect for my environment. It would have to be my kids were a little more perfect, and then their kids were a little more perfect, and then their kids were a little more perfect, and you keep doing that until finally, way down the line, my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandkids are perfectly suited for the environment. That's what this means. It's not an individual change, it is a population change. 2, natural selection can amplify or diminish only heritable traits. This means natural selection can't just suddenly make it happen. It has to be something in the genes that will change. This means you have to be able to pass it on. Think genetics again. And then 3, evolution is not goal-directed. It does not lead to perfectly adapted organisms. It can't. It doesn't know how the environment is going to have evolved and changed. If you look at our current climate crisis right now, what's happening with this world, clearly this is not what most people would have predicted a long time ago. So things that were perfectly suited for the environment, say 10 years ago, right now would be having more issues because it's harder to breathe. We currently have a pandemic running around, so evolution is not goal directed. It's not like we are going to make this the perfect whatever. You can't, because everything changes. Everything. All the populations are constantly changing. Your environment is constantly changing. We are constantly changing. That is part of life, is change. Now, here is where I'm going to take that moment to tell you about Lamarck. The difference between Darwin and Lamarck. Both of them pointed out that clearly things are changing, that there is evolutionary change, because you can't deny it if you actually remove from your brain what's been drilled in of just simply evolution is people came from monkeys. And again, that's not what evolution is. So as soon as you can disengage from that, you have to admit that things have changed throughout history. And I'm talking millions of years. Things have changed. Now, if you look at that and you happen to be a science person, you're going to want to be able to say, oh, hey, I think it's this. So Darwin said it was tiny little changes over a very long period of time. That it was a little change here and a little change here and a little change here, and it's passed on through the genes. The example to compare him and Lamarck, because both of them believed that it was changing each generation. The big difference between the two is Darwin pointed out that it was because the surviving ones passed on those genes to their offspring. And Lamarck basically saw it as the ones in this generation made adjustments and then passed those adjustments on to their offspring. So the example that was used were giraffes. According to Darwin, as the food source got higher and higher, the giraffes that had the longer neck were able to reach up and get more food. This way, those giraffes were able to reproduce. The ones who had the shorter necks basically died off because they couldn't get enough food. And so generation after generation, the giraffes with longer necks continued to reproduce, and that's how we got the giraffe with the long neck. According to Lamarck, basically the giraffes stretched and stretched their neck, and so then they had babies that had longer necks, and then those giraffes stretched their necks, and then they had babies that had longer necks. the equivalent of this would be if somebody works out a whole lot and they have a baby. Lamarck's idea, that baby would be born totally ripped. They would have all these muscles already because mom and dad had the muscles. But I think we know it doesn't quite work that way. You might inherit the genes for the possibility of better muscles, but a baby is not going to automatically be born with those types of muscles. So it's that kind of thing. So I like to make sure to point that out. One more thing to say, but I want to see if we get there because I can't remember. So, nope, I don't think we do. So let me say one other thing. Darwin was not the only one who came up with this idea of natural selection, survival of the fittest. There was another scientist on the other side of the planet, the other side of the earth, who's coming up with exactly the same idea at exactly the same time. And since I was just talking about Lamarck and I made reference to Anaximander, which is an ancient philosopher, I actually wrote an entire report on Anaximander and the aquatic ape theory, but I'm not going to go into that right now. But since I was talking about them, I swear I cannot remember the name of the other scientist right now. And if I remember it, I'll just blurt it out of nowhere. But anyway, there's another scientist coming up with exactly the same stuff as Darwin at the same time. Darwin did not want to publish his findings. He did not want to publish what he believed about evolution because it went against basically what everybody was saying. It went against the church, and he knew that the church ruled, and he did not want to be an outcast. So he really did not want to actually publish his material, but he had friends who heard that somebody else was about to publish it, and they knew how many years Darwin had worked on this and how much information he had, so they pushed him to publish it and got it published. And so where all of us continuously talk about Darwin and make cracks about Darwinism and things like that, there was another scientist who was figuring out exactly the same thing at exactly the same time on the other side of the world from Darwin. It's just Darwin had friends that, pushed him out there faster. And that's why we know all about Darwin. And at the moment, I can't remember the other guy's name, and it's driving me crazy. But I suck at names, so hopefully I'll remember. Anyway, now, scientists can observe natural selection in action. Talked before about the DDT at the very beginning of this. Here we're going to talk about another one similar. It's still pesticides. So we have seen many, many times, because if you think about it, insects have very fast generations. And I know it sounds weird to say fast generations, but like humans, our generations take a while. So to see evolutionary change in humans, it's not a likelihood to really, really see very well, other than the fact if you look at the documentation of how few people actually have wisdom teeth fully grow in, or the shrinking of the pinky toe. Those are two evolutionary things for humans that you can actually look at now. I tell people all the time to take a look at your grandparents' feet and notice the difference between the size of their pinky toe and your pinky toe. You'll notice there's a difference. And then the wisdom teeth, because historically, way back when, we used to have to a lot more. We had bigger, stronger jaws. There was more space. We needed the wisdom teeth. Now, you have some people who never even have their wisdom teeth show up. And we're having more and more people have to have the wisdom teeth removed because there's not enough space in their mouth. And I keep doing it like this because my father had his wisdom teeth. Like, he grew them in. But me, my wisdom teeth were growing in perfectly straight, but my mouth had room for half of each tooth. So right before I turned 16, I had to have mine removed. Then you meet other people who they're like 30s when their wisdom teeth start to show up, and then there are people whose wisdom teeth never even show. So that is proof of evolution working, where our wisdom teeth are disappearing because we do not need them anymore. So That's a human evolution thing you can actually track. It's kind of cool. Now, here, because the insects have much faster generations, we can see that as we're doing the mass pesticides, what happens are the weakest, again, think genetics. So think, if you think dominant and recessive, basically you'll have this one gene that can resist the pesticide. All the ones that can't die. What's left are the strong ones, the ones who can resist the pesticide. So if all the ones that get killed off by the pesticide are dead, they can't reproduce, the only ones that can reproduce are the ones that are resistant. Basically, we are just creating pesticide-resistant insects. Happens all the time. We've been watching it. This also happens with antibiotics, which we'll get to. So, examples of evolutionary adaptation reveal two important points about natural selection. Natural selection is more of an editing process than a creative mechanism, so editing as in it's cutting out what can't survive. And natural selection is contingent on time and place, favoring those heritable traits in a varying population that fit the current local environment. This means the insect example before, I started to say above, it's not above anything, but before, those same insects, the ones that when we're spraying the pesticide, the group die, and so only the resistant ones are reproducing. They're evolving to be only the resistant insects. In a completely different area where you're not spraying a pesticide, that's not going to happen. If you use a different pesticide, you might have a completely different grouping of the insects that survive. That's what it means by contingent on time and place. Now, in what sense is natural selection more an editing process than a creative process? Oops, I just answered that a second ago, didn't I? Where it's not creating something from scratch, it's cutting out what can't survive. That's all that is. So, evolution of populations. Mutations. If you remember, we talked about this quite a bit in Bio 123 when we talked about mutations and the DNA replication, and then we got to genetics. So that's what this is doing. It's bringing back all that stuff from Bio 123. So mutations, ultimate source of the genetic variation that serves as raw material for evolution. When there is a slight mutation, sometimes it is beneficial, sometimes it's harmful, sometimes you don't even notice anything. Hopefully you remember me talking about that in Bio 123. Well, here is the ultimate area for evolution, because if there's a mutation that happens to be beneficial, then that's what's going to keep getting passed on. I mean, that's it. Because organisms that reproduce sexually, most of the genetic material, variation results from the unique combination of the alleles. Again, genetics, covered it. Fresh assortment of existing alleles arise every generation from 3 random components of sexual reproduction, crossing over. Hopefully you remember meiosis 1, prophase 1, crossing over. That's the absolute part that you had to remember. I said it over and over again. Crossing over happens in prophase 1. And that's because when it does that, and that's where we get a lot of our assortments. Then we have independent assortment of the chromosomes, metaphase 1 in meiosis, and random fertilization. Random fertilization is important. That is what helps get a lot of variation in there. Here is our checkpoint question. What is the ultimate source of genetic variation? And what is the source of most genetic variation in a population that reproduces sexually? Boom, there's our answer. Mutation. That is our big thing, is mutation. And again, because of sexual reproduction, you're bringing in different alleles from different groups. That's what's causing a big mix-up. Now, population. Population is a group of individuals of the same species that live in the same area and interbreed. Gene pool. A gene pool consists of all copies of every type of allele at every locus and all members of the population. And microevolution, micro as in small. This is a change in the frequency of alleles in a population's gene pool and evolution occurring on its smallest scale. If you remember in the welcome PowerPoint video, when I said, what am I supposed to do? And I made that comment about key phrases, key words, and I said, I am not going to give you a vocabulary test, but you need to understand certain things in order to be able to answer questions. Population, gene pool, yeah, those are some of them. If you have ever heard people make cracks about interbreeding and they're like, oh, that gene pool was too small, that's what they're talking about. You need to add fresh genes to the gene pool on occasion in order to keep it from being too small. Yeah, we'll get more into that later. Now, here, I highlighted a word. Why can't an individual evolve? This is an important thing. If you remember this whole PowerPoint, I keep telling you, evolution is for a population, not for an individual. Why can't an individual evolve? Well, it's because it's a change in the alleles. It's a change genetically that you can pass on. That's a small change. Evolution is changing over a large period of time. So an individual can't. An individual can show evidence of evolving from like generations back, like I said, with the wisdom teeth or the size of your pinky toe. But the individual himself, you can't be born one way and then your body adjust throughout your lifetime and then you're a completely different thing by the end. It doesn't work that way. Okay, we're getting there, I promise. Hardy-Weinberg equation. This can test whether a population is evolving. In order to do this, you have the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Equilibrium means it's equal. So there you go. The Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium states that allele and genotype frequencies will remain constant, equilibrium. If a population is large, mating is random, and there is no mutation, gene flow, or natural selection. That means all of those have to take place for nothing to change. The Hardy-Weinberg equation can be used to test whether evolution is occurring in a population. So we're going to take this and have an imaginary iguana population. And you're going to go, oh my gosh, I remember doing this with genetics, because that's literally what this is. So here we're going to have two types of iguanas. We have one that has webbing on his feet and one that does not have webbing on his feet. And we're going to look at the frequencies of the alleles in the gene pool of the original population and then see what we think about evolution. So we have our phenotype. Remember, phenotype is what you see. And then we have our genotype. So if you look at this with the genes and the phenotype, you should be able to assume that the non-webbing is the dominant trait and the webbed is recessive. So the only way you're going to get the webbed feet is if you are homozygous recessive. Now, we have a total of 500 iguanas. We have 320 that are homozygous dominant, 160 that are heterozygous, and 20 that are homozygous recessive. So now, in order to look at their frequencies, we did not do frequencies last quarter. But to look at their frequencies, you simply take their total and divide it by the total number of animals. So 320 divided by 500 gives you 64, well, 0.64. That means 64% of the population are homozygous dominant. 32% are heterozygous, and only 4% are homozygous recessive. Now, when you notice the next one where it says number of alleles in the gene pool, and you're looking at that saying total 1,000, and you go, where in the world did they get the 1,000? It's because you've got one gene from mom, one gene from dad. So where you have 500 animals, each animal has 2 of these alleles. So that makes 1,000 because 500 times 2 is 1,000. Now you take your 640, because 320 times 2 is 640, big W. You take 160 big W from your heterozygous, you add those together, that gives you 800. So 800 over 1,000 gives you 80%. So 80% of these animals are going to have no webbing. And then you do the same thing with your little w's. And when you do that, you get 200. 200 divided by 1,000 will give you 20%. So this is how you figure out your ratios of 80% of these animals are going to have the dominant gene to pass on, and 20% will only have, or will have, the recessive gene. So if you look at these numbers, chances are, evolutionary speaking, you're going to end up with the no-webbed feet. Hope that made sense. Okay, Hardy-Weinberg equation can test whether a population is evolving, just like what we just looked at. You have your Punnett square, use the gamete allele frequencies, and because the genotype frequencies are the same as in the parent population, the allele frequencies are also the same. And the gene pool of this population is in a state of equilibrium, which is the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. So if you look at this one, we've got all of our frequencies that we just looked at. The next generation should be about the same. The next generation should be about the same. So that's trying to show you equilibrium. Now, here's a more interesting one. Hardy-Weinberg equation useful in public health science. Well, they actually use this to try to predict various things, and the more people who do the 23andMe and the Ancestry DNA test, all those things, they're making a huge bank full of all these people's genetics, and it's answering a lot of questions, and we're getting to see more of how this works and how things are popping up. But anyway, 1 out of 10,000 babies born in the UK, or the UK, what in the world? In the United States has this particular disorder. I am just going to say PKU because look at that word. Anyway, this is an inherited inability to break down an amino acid, this particular amino acid. Now, health problems associated with PKU can be prevented by paying very close attention to a diet that limits that intake. This is why you should actually read the ingredients. Take a look. Anytime you see an ingredient on a list like aspartame and they have that little mark next to it, if you look at the bottom, it then tells you that it contains that particular amino acid. So, knowing what the different things mean is extremely helpful. So if the person is one of the 1 out of 10,000 that cannot break this down, they are one of the ones who drinking all these diet sodas is actually harming them. So when you see the Facebook posts and the things about, oh, I have a friend who had a relative who had all these horrible health issues because they drank Diet Coke, and then when they quit drinking Diet Coke, they felt so much better. Yes, it's fear-mongering. It's just a scare tactic. However, it's also possible, and it's not because aspartame is horrible for everybody on the planet, but if you are one of the 10,000 in the US who can't process this, and then you're drinking a lot of Diet Coke, and Diet Coke contains aspartame, and aspartame contains this amino acid, over a period of time it's building up, and yes, you are going to have health issues. So understanding what all of it means is extremely helpful. Mechanisms of microevolution. Whew, we're getting close to the end now. Yay! So, We have natural selection, genetic drift, and gene flow. All of these can cause microevolution. Remember, micro, small, little changes. We've already talked about natural selection. Now we're going to talk a little bit about genetic drift and gene flow. So we have what's called the bottleneck effect and the founder effect. Both of these can lead to genetic drift. Bottleneck effect, we're about to have a picture for this. Think of what a bottle is shaped like. It's shaped like this. So you have all this stuff here, you're trying to get it out the other end, the narrow end, that's going to affect what comes out. So that's pretty much what this is. So the bottleneck effect leads to a loss of genetic diversity when a population is greatly reduced. It goes from here to here. So you're going to lose something in that quick change. Then we also have founder effect. Founder, like, whoo, I found it. So this is like when a few individuals colonize an area and then they have a whole bunch of babies. Obviously, if only a few individuals showed up there and then they repopulate, that's going to cause its own little microevolution. So how might gene flow between populations living in different habitats actually interfere with each population's adaptation to its local environment? Right there. Introduction of alleles that may not be beneficial in a particular habitat prevents the population living there from becoming fully adapted to its local conditions. This means, again, if this little group gets into this area and then they just keep repopulating, if they didn't have the genes, the alleles that are going to make them best suited for the area, they can't just create them, because remember, it is editing, not creating. So if they didn't even have the genes to begin with, it's not going to make them best suited. It's just going to be sheer numbers is the only reason they're there. It's lack of competition. As soon as something else comes in that is similar enough, then they can actually breed out the other ones. It's really interesting because when we get to the human part, I'll talk about Neanderthals and the fact that we bred out Neanderthals. Homo sapiens bred with Neanderthals to such a degree that Neanderthals disappeared and we just kind of absorbed them. And here's the cool thing. Been reading articles because I'm obsessed with the coronavirus stuff, and they're finding that a lot of people who are getting affected by the coronavirus, it has to do with the Neanderthal genes, and that's just phenomenal. I'm trying to find a few more articles and I'm going to share it with the class, but I don't know, it's just cool. So this is trying to show you bottleneck, where it shows you shove all these different colored marbles basically in this bottle. Each one's supposed to be showing different types of alleles. And then if you're like shaking it to knock it out of there, it's going to limit how much variation you have because only so much can come out. So it goes from population to population. Okay, only natural selection consistently leads to adaptive evolution. So natural selection is the only one that sits there and actually starts making it where each generation is better suited for the environment. Natural selection is the only one that does that. Relative fitness is the contribution an individual makes to the gene pool of the next generation. So relative fitness, again, it doesn't mean the one who goes on the treadmill the longest, the one who runs marathons, the one who bench presses the biggest things, the one who thinks they're the best looking thing on the planet. That has nothing to do with relative fitness. Relative fitness, like if you remember the sneaky male, would be the gene that helps that little frog kind of tuck away and hide and have the mental part, the knowledge, knowing, hey, I can jump out here and continue. That would be a relative fitness. I was about to say, I remember talking about somebody losing their hair constantly. That would be another one in a very hot area. The one who doesn't waste energy on creating hair that's not needed. That would be a relative fitness contribution. So, as a result of natural selection, favorable traits increase in a population because they're better suited, they live longer, they are able to reproduce. So, checkpoint question. Explain how the phrase survival of the fittest differs from the biological definition of relative fitness. Oh, I think I just already talked about this one. Um, so again, when you hear survival of the fittest, I would like you to do it always, but at least definitely in this class, remember the biological definition instead of what people say, okay? Natural selection can affect the distribution of phenotypes in a population. Remember, phenotypes, observable trait. We have the stabilizing selection. The stabilizing selection favors the intermediate phenotype. That means the one that's kind of in between, and so it just stabilizes the whole population. We've got graphs and stuff coming in a second. Directional selection. This is where it shifts. So direction, it moves. So this is what will shift the overall makeup. One for like one type of extreme. And again, pictures. Then we have disruptive selection. This occurs when something happens and it basically splits it. And so it happens on both ends. So stabilizing is kind of, it stays right there in between. Directional, it shifts. Disruptive, it splits them up. So graphs, and then we go a little more into this. So if we're looking at the mice, look at their fur color. Stabilizing, you just kind of pick the one in the middle. It's kind of generic. If you look at directional, it's shifting it over towards one side. So here, for that directional one, if you're looking at the color of the mice's fur, this would be like if originally there was a lot of different areas. There were shadows and trees and sand, that kind of thing. If suddenly there's no sand, there's only straw and dead leaves and wood, obviously only the darker ones would be needed. But if you look at the color of the fur, the darkest one could be more in the shadows in the darker area, and the lighter one could be out in like the straw. So that's what that's talking about, where something happens and they all slowly evolve because they're the ones who survive. And then disruptive, this is where something happens and it totally splits. So imagine that whole nice field that had everything, and then somebody, like, I don't know, puts a street, a road right through the center, and now you have beach on one side and woods on the other. That would disrupt their group, and so that would change their phenotypes like that. So again, we have directional, where the whole thing shifts. They're showing you here an example of a bird. The original population was one way, they had a certain size. Then, in order to survive the cold weather, only certain sizes survived the cold weather, and those were the larger birds. And so after the cold weather, the whole thing shifted, and now all the birds are a larger size. So that's directional. Stabilizing, birth weight. Human birth weight, this is a perfect example. The most average birth weight for a human baby is right around the 7-pound mark, between 7 and 8, but it's like mid sevens. Sevens is, that's where it's stabilized. Most of the time, if they're too low in birth weight, they don't survive. If they are too large in birth weight, interestingly enough, they do not survive. The most common survival, bam, right there around the 7-pound mark. So that would be stabilizing. And then disruptive. This is where something happens and it splits. So here they're showing you African black-bellied finches. The purple is survived, the blue is did not survive. And it's showing you the width of the lower beak. It's just showing you that something happened, and then these little ones and these little ones survived. Notice how many are gone. I'm going to use the laser pointer because this one I think is a little harder to see. We had some kind of event that happened. It's like bam, and it slammed through. We have this little cluster of a narrow beak, and then over here another small cluster of a much longer beak. So width of lower beak. There's this cluster and this cluster. All the other ones around it are gone. And so that is disruptive selection. Those are two totally different types of finches now. All right, so what type of selection probably resulted in the color variations evident in the garter snake seen above? All of these snakes in this image are all the same type of snake, but clearly when you look at them phenotypically, they are different. So what type of selection was this? Go ahead, guess. Guess. Did you guess? Bam. Disruptive. Because they're still pretty much the same. However, something happened where each of these were what resulted. Now, sexual selection. Sexual selection, form of natural selection, where individuals with certain characteristics are more likely than others to obtain mates. There's a bunch of things with this, and this one is so much more fun to talk about in class, but we'll just, run with this. Secondary sex characteristics can give individuals an advantage in mating. When you talk about this kind of thing, normally there is one thing that most people think of right off the bat, and that is the peacock. We have a peacock and a peahen. I don't know if you know it, but the peahen, that's the female peacock. She's got just that little bit on top of her head. And then we've got our peacock with that big plume of feathers. This is so he can attract her attention, because the basic gist here, and I made reference to it a long time ago in this PowerPoint, the basic gist here is the fact that if the peacock can be that colorful, that flamboyant, and still survive, he must be a great survivor. And so that makes him a good choice for the genetic material for your offspring. Because if you're going to spend energy making babies, you're going to want them to survive. So picking the most out there survivor would kind of show that they're a good choice. This is why a lot of times the bucks with the most antlers, the largest set of antlers, they get the doe. And it's because, the female, because each year he's getting more points on his antlers. And so if a buck has shown he can survive this long, clearly that's a good gene pool for your offspring. So that's what happens a lot with the sexual selection. Now, in some species, intrasexual selection occurs. This means within the same species or within the same sex. Inter means different, so like between sexes, between boy and girl. Intra is like boy, boy, girl, girl. So in some species, the intrasexual selection occurs where the individuals compete directly with members of the same sex. So think of any documentary you've seen where you see the two bucks slamming heads together. They're like fighting with their antlers, trying to prove I am the top dog. And the females are just kind of hanging back watching it. It's because the one who wins the fight has proven he's the strongest, hence he deserves to pass on his genetic material. Eventually he gets too old to fight off the younger one, and then at that point the young one's proven I'm stronger, I can now compete. So that's the intrasexual selection. Then more common is sexual selection, where the female chooses the male or the male chooses the female. In reality, usually it's the male trying to get the attention and it's the female who picks. The reason for this is because typically the female is expending way more energy on creating the babies, and she's the one spending more effort raising or doing whatever for the babies. And I say doing whatever because remember, this is not just humans, this is like all organisms. And so it's not always exactly the same, because I can't say all, because again, think of seahorses, because a seahorse, the male carries the young. So it's interesting. Nature's fascinating. But anyway, checkpoint question. I forgot to delete the 3 of 3. Males with the most elaborate ornamentation may garner the most mates. How might choosing such a mate be advantageous to a female? Well, I kind of already covered this. It's because it's a signal that he can survive, so it's worth passing on. Evolution of drug-resistant microorganisms is a serious public health concern. Oh, heck yes it is. When I made that comment about the pesticides with the insects, I said we're getting to something else. Here we are. We're to the something else. Antibiotics. Huge issue with antibiotics. They are one of the most overprescribed things and overused, and because of this, we are getting antibiotic-resistant strains. of stuff. This is a really big deal. This is the reason why if you feel sick, you don't just say, I need antibiotics. Antibiotics only help if it's a bacterial infection. If it's not bacterial, it's not going to help you with anything whatsoever. All it's going to do is affect everything else. It's not going to make you better. So like the coronavirus, yes, I know I keep coming back to it, but the coronavirus is a virus. It is not antibacterial, so antibiotic is not going to do crap to help you get rid of the coronavirus. Some people may choose to take it thinking it will at least keep you from having anything else. Now, if you have the coronavirus and an ear infection, sure, take the antibiotics for the ear infection. It's not going to help coronavirus. It's a virus. Virus is not bacterial. Now, here's the other big thing. A lot of people, especially here in the States, a lot of people don't have the best medical care, the best medical coverage. It costs a lot to try to be healthy. If you are a typical American, you do not have 100% full coverage of everything, and you do not have a buttload of money in the bank to pay for everything in order to get medicine. So you will be tempted sometimes to do this. Please don't ever do this. And if I ever know you to do this, if I can reach through there and smack you upside the head, I'll do it. I have known plenty of people who they get the antibiotics because they're sick. They're taking the antibiotics. They start to feel better. So then they stop and they say, I'm going to hold on to these antibiotics for later when I can't afford it. Don't do that. That is the worst thing you can do. When the doctor says take all of these, it means take all of these. Because just like the insects with the pesticides, what happens? First batch of antibiotics kills off the absolute weakest of this infection. And then the next little bit is killing off the next batch. You have to take enough antibiotics to 100% kill all of it in your body. 100%. That's why normally your antibiotics consumption should be a tiny bit past the death of the last of the infection, because you want to make sure any little stragglers in there have been killed. If not, all you're doing is letting the strongest of the strong reproduce. That's why so many times somebody will take antibiotics, they start to feel better, then they stop, then it comes back and it's worse than it was before. You have to make sure to knock them all out. Due to antibiotics being overprescribed, people not taking them completely like they're supposed to, and here's the other one, the food industry. A lot of places, they just feed the cattle and the chickens and the pigs, they just feed them antibiotics as part of their daily regimen, trying to keep them healthy. By doing this, all they're doing is creating stronger and stronger and stronger and more antibiotic resistant strains of illnesses. This is why if you're going to eat meat, please get the ones that are organic, or it specifically says that they're antibiotic free. You do not want to help keep them doing this, because you don't want to have a whole bunch of things that now cannot be cured by antibiotics. Now, 2013, I really do wish this brand new book had more updated things than, 7 years ago, but whatever. 2013, the CDC reported drug-resistant microorganisms infect more than 2 million people and cause 23,000 deaths in the US every year. They have also identified 15 microorganisms that pose urgent or serious threats to public health. The next slide, I'm going to show you a picture of something that's concerning, just so you know. So, explain why the following statement is incorrect. Antibiotics have created resistant bacteria. They did not create resistant bacteria. We did that by misusing antibiotics. So, what happened is we kept using antibiotics not the proper way, which caused a change in the frequency of the alleles of the bacteria out there. So we basically made the bacteria evolve in order to survive. So we screwed it up. So this is showing you examples. And the reason I say this is disturbing is because what's in yellow is the transmission route, and we've got a disease listed. What the little wedge is what is now antibiotic resistant. A lot of these we can still mostly kick. We are having way more ear infections that are antibiotic resistant. Anyone who had me last quarter for Bio 123, maybe you remember when the class started, I came in, I told you that I had a really bad ear infection, and I said, don't worry because it's not contagious, and I was wearing a mask, but that I was going to do this a few times because it was really bad. I had to go through the Z-Pack, that antibiotic thing, then it was flaring back up, and then they had to give me like this Mac Daddy antibiotic where I took 2 of these pills that were like, no joke, this big, twice a day for 10 days to try to kick it. Probably should have also gotten a shot of antibiotics for all of it. It was a bad ear infection, but it's because these suckers are getting more and more resistant because of people's misuse of antibiotics. But the one that really concerns me is the first one, the gonorrhea. This is an STD. Again, since it's an STD, it's transmitted through sex. And it used to be relatively easy to cure. You just gave somebody an antibiotic. Well, such misuse for the antibiotics, they started to have to do a 1-2 punch. And so then it was like you take this antibiotic followed by this antibiotic because gonorrhea was getting to where it was resistant to this one, but if you did this, then it knocked them out. Well, now we have strains of gonorrhea that it's resistant to, and we are quickly running out of anything that will actually kill this. So we are in the process of creating a non-curable STD. And I'm not talking HIV and AIDS here. I'm talking something that has been around a long time, and our misuse of medication is causing it to become something that we will not be able to cure. I mention this so when you hear a lot of things where people say, oh, just take this, it takes care of it. Don't do that. Actually educate yourself. Make sure you're using stuff responsibly, because we don't want to keep just making more and more and more super pathogens because, hello, we're already in one pandemic. Let's not add more stuff to it. So, diploidy. Do you remember haploids and diploids from last quarter? Well, here we go. The diploid preserves variation by hiding the recessive allele. That's the dominant and recessive traits that we were talking about. Balancing selection occurs when the natural selection keeps the stable frequencies of 2 or more phenotypic forms in a population. So again, balances. Heterozygote. The heterozygote advantage is when having one of each helps. There's a benefit to having both. And if anybody remembers at the end of Bio 123, when I talked about sickle cell, that is one of the examples. So why would natural selection tend to reduce genetic variation more in populations of haploid organisms than in populations of diploid organisms? Well, because all alleles in a haploid organism are phenotypically expressed, and so screened by natural selection. There you go. Now, sickle cell. Remember, I did talk about this. You will find that there is more of the sickle cell allele in areas where the malaria is more prevalent. We talked about this in Bio 123, and you even had on your, it was on your final exam. You even had on your final exam a nice huge problem about sickle cell, heterozygotes, malaria, whole thing. So, natural selection cannot fashion perfect organisms. It can't. It's not possible because, again, everything is changing. So, evolution of organisms is constrained. It can act only on existing variations. Remember, it is an editing tool, not a creation tool. Limited by historical constraints. It can't just, again, create something out of nothing. Adaptations are often compromises. It means it's not just normally knocking something out. It's like, hey, this is pretty good and this is pretty good. Oh, here we go. And then it tries to put them together. And I just remembered something. At the end of this, I have to remember to say it has to do with homologous and analogous. Okay, anyway. Chance, natural selection, and the environment interact. All of these take place. So you have it just happens to happen. So sometimes it could be, I don't know, there's a massive storm and a stream floods, which causes groups here to get separated from each other. That's a chance. That's also the environment, the flood and the movement, and then the natural selection. So environments are constantly changing, and that's why everything is always changing. Now, humans owe much of their physical versatility and athleticism to their flexible limbs and joints. But why are we prone to sprains, torn ligaments, and dislocations? Well, isn't that a good question? Have you ever wondered that? I started to think of a movie where somebody made a comment, and I am not going to go there, but it was making me think about that. Like, if we can do all these things, why do we also have the others? Well, that has to do with the compromise. In order to have grown to where we can do as much as we can, sometimes stuff's going to be hurt, you know? I want to say I talked about it in Bio 1, 2, 3. I definitely talk about it later in Bio 1, 2, 4. But like when you're working out and you're building muscles. Oh yeah, when I was talking about aerobic and anaerobic in Bio 1, 2, 3. But when you're working out and like you're doing weights and you see that the muscles start to get bigger, it's because of tiny tears. And so that's how you're actually doing it. So your structural reinforcement is getting changed a little bit. So that's what that is. Okay, so before I read all these, well, I'm not actually going to read all of them. Think way back too early in this PowerPoint, I feel like I've done this forever. When I was talking about the human's arm and then the bat wing, and those are homologous. So they are structurally similar, but they all have different actions because the bat wing is for flight, while the human arm and hand is for reaching and grasping. We might get to the analogous in the next PowerPoint, but I want to mention it now. That's where you can see that something has evolved to do the same thing, but it has a completely different structure. And the example I always use for this one, and this is going to be your lecture assignment 1. Lecture assignment 1, I want you to tell me all about this. So homologous would be like our human arm versus the bat wing, or the whale's pectoral fin, the flipper, where structurally it's built the same when you look at it, but they do completely different things. Analogous would be where the structure is different, but evolutionary wise, they evolved for the same reason. So my example for that is a bird's wing and a butterfly's wing. A bird's wing is for flight. A butterfly's wing is for flight. You can even say a bee's wing is for flight. All of those are for flight. They're all built completely differently. So while all of them evolved flight, you can tell that they don't have the same common ancestor because the way the wing was developed is completely different. You would never mistake a bird wing for a butterfly wing, right? I just find it fascinating, and in one of the videos for your embryology lab, it talks about those, so make sure to make note of that. So your lecture assignment 1 is to tell me the difference and see if you can come up with anything else. Tell me what I said were the same, you know, like the human arm, bat wing, whale, and the bird and the butterfly, bee. But see if you can come up with another example too. So tell me what mine were, what they mean, and give me your own examples as well. That's your lecture assignment for lecture assignment number 1. Yeah. Anyway, so now you should be able to do a whole bunch of this stuff. I am not reading all of these because, by God, you can read them, and I'm kind of tired of talking. Oh, look, Thomas Malthus. That's another one that I've talked about before. Anyone who has me or has ever had me for environmental science, I talk about Thomas Malthus in the very first week. He's the one who pointed out, Thomas Malthus actually pointed out that Our human population is growing exponentially while our food production is linear. And so it doing this is causing a bigger gap, which is going to cause a lot of people to die off. So that's what his was. Anyway, you have all of these different little things. So you have been taught a whole bunch in this past, 73 hours that this PowerPoint presentation is. So if you think of any questions pertaining to this chapter, let me know. Email me, tell me it has to do with this, whatever. This really is just here to help me remember this is the end and give me a way to wrap it up and end this. And my fingers are friggin' freezing. It is cold out here and it's fully light outside. It's late enough and I'm about to take a break, process this, post it. So I'm wondering if anyone's going to actually watch it today. That would be kind of cool. Let me know if you do. Let me know if you watch this on Tuesday. Because man, I'm trying. Please be patient. I am trying to get 14 and 15 up next. I have to adjust the PowerPoint first and then get it done. And I am tutoring, a total of, I think, 5 hours today. So if I can get chapter 14 done today, I will. If not, tomorrow, Wednesday, I will get 14 and 15 up. So my goal is to have everything done and up there by the close of Wednesday. So you've got plenty of time. Anyway, email me if you have questions, anything like that, and I'll see you in over a week. Yeah. Peace out.